The email arrived at 11:03 a.m. It wasn't from HR, it wasn't from a lawyer, it was a forward, a company-wide memo from Jeffrey himself, and the subject line was a new chapter of integrity. My name wasn't in the subject, but it was the ghost haunting every single word. The memo was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, all about synergy and accountability and right-sizing our strategic commitments. It was 3 paragraphs of polished nothingness that all added up to one thing: I was out. Fired. My decade of work, the lives saved, the flawless financials erased in an email I was CC'd on, almost as an afterthought. It was the most profound and public professional humiliation I could have ever imagined. If you've ever poured your soul into something, only to have it snatched away and have your name dragged through the mud, then you know a fraction of what I felt in that moment. Stick around and let me know in the comments if this sounds familiar, because it helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void here. My name is Alexandra. For 10 years, I directed the Aquapura initiative for the Sterling Hope Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world. Aquapura wasn't just a project, it was my life's work. We weren't just drilling wells, we were building self-sustaining water purification systems in remote communities across sub-Saharan Africa. We used a low-cost, high-impact model I had designed myself, a model that empowered local teams to maintain and operate the systems long after we were gone. Our metrics were undeniable. Infant mortality rates in our project zones dropped by an average of 60%. Waterborne illness, which had been a constant specter of death, became a rarity. Our budgets were legendarily lean, our audits pristine. The old CEO, a wonderful man named Arthur Sterling, grandson of the founder, used to call me his miracle worker. He'd say, "Alexandra, you do more with $1 than the government does with 1,000. He understood that the work wasn't about splashy press releases. It was about the quiet, steady, unglamorous business of saving lives. That all changed when Arthur retired and the board brought in Jeffrey. Jeffrey was everything Arthur was not. He was a tidal wave of charisma, with a dazzling smile, a wardrobe that cost more than one of my purification units, and a vocabulary woven entirely from corporate buzzwords. He didn't talk about people, he talked about human capital. He didn't talk about projects, he talked about verticals and deliverables. He loved the sound of his own voice, especially when it was bouncing off the walls of the boardroom. He saw the foundation not as a trust, but as a brand. A brand he was here to disrupt. In our first meeting, he barely looked at my presentation. His eyes, a shade of blue so pale, they seemed almost transparent, glazed over as I walked him through the data, the maps, the life-saving impact. He just steepled his fingers, leaned back in his leather chair, and said, "This is all very noble, Alexandra. Very boots on the ground. But where's the sizzle? We need to be thinking about scale, about platforms, about leveraging our brand equity into next-gen impact solutions." I remember the smell of his cologne, something sharp and citrusy, that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I felt like an artifact, a dusty relic he had discovered in a back room of his shiny new museum. He saw a field operator, a charity worker. He didn't see the woman who had negotiated with warlords for safe passage, who had redesigned pump gaskets on the back of a napkin in a Land Rover, who could read a balance sheet with the same fluency she read a topographical map. The Ghost Project story broke 6 months into his tenure. A journalist from a major international paper got a tip. An anonymous source claimed our flagship project in the Kivu region, a massive expansion I had personally overseen the funding for, was a complete fabrication. The school had never been built. The purification system was a patch of sun-baked dirt. The $500,000 allocated for it vanished. The article was brutal, and it named me as director of the initiative, as the one whose department was at the center of the scandal. The truth was, I had tried to warn him. 2 months earlier, I'd noticed irregularities. The progress reports from Kivu were slick. Too slick. They were full of stock photos and vague, jargon-filled updates that sounded suspiciously like Jeffrey's own emails. The wire transfers were being signed off by his new chief financial officer, bypassing my department's long-established protocols. When I brought my concerns to Jeffrey, he just smiled that brilliant, empty smile. "Alexandra," he said, patting my arm in a way that was meant to be reassuring, but felt like a brand being seared into my skin. "You're a visionary in the field, but you've got to let the finance guys handle the finances. We're streamlining. We're innovating. We're moving at the speed of business, not the speed of bureaucracy." He was so condescending, so utterly dismissive, that a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. He shut me down. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The loyalty I had felt to the foundation began to curdle into a different kind of resolve. I stopped thinking like an employee and started thinking like a strategist. That afternoon, I bought a micro recorder, the size of a paperclip. I started a new file on my personal laptop, encrypted and firewalled, and I started documenting everything. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this wasn't just mismanagement. It was a controlled demolition, and he was planning to bury me in the rubble. The day the story broke, he called an all-hands meeting in the main auditorium. He stood on the stage, looking somber and decisive, a captain steadying his ship in a storm of his own making. He spoke of the Foundation's unwavering commitment to transparency and accountability. He said that a thorough internal investigation had been conducted, and then he said the words that would echo in my head for months. "It has become clear that this tragic failure was ultimately the result of a profound lack of oversight within the Aquapura initiative, and for that, I must hold the director, Alexandra, accountable." He said my name without even looking at me. He announced my immediate termination, effective now. There was a collective gasp in the room. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes turning to me. I just sat there, my back straight, my hands clasped in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. He assumed he had won. He assumed I was just a field operator who didn't understand the game. He didn't know that for the past 2 months, I hadn't been just doing my job. I had been building a weapon. In the file I had already prepared, the one addressed to the Foundation's largest and most influential private donor, contained the one thing Jeffrey couldn't spin or rebrand: the sound of his own voice, meticulously outlining his plan to gut my project and divert the funds to a high-risk, high-return tech venture, a venture owned by his brother. The game wasn't over. He had just made his opening move. Now, it was my turn. The silence in my apartment that night was a physical presence. It was heavier than air, pressing in on me from all sides. I walked through the rooms, my heels clicking on the hardwood floors, the sound unnaturally loud. My phone had been buzzing non-stop since the memo went out. A few messages of genuine concern from my core team, a flood of awkward, pitying texts from other colleagues, and a dozen calls from reporters. I turned it off and tossed it in a drawer. The noise of the outside world felt like an intrusion, a violation of the sterile bubble of shock I was in. I stood in front of the large map of Africa that covered one wall of my study. It was covered in pins, each one representing a life-sustaining project. Red pins for completed systems, yellow for those in progress. There was a cluster of proposed blue pins in the Kivu region, marking the Ghost Project. I reached out and my fingers traced the outline of the Democratic Republic of Congo. My mind wasn't on the money, not really. It was on a woman named Elodie, the leader of the local women's cooperative in a village we'd worked in 5 years ago. I could see her face as clearly as if she were in the room with me. She had these deep, kind eyes, and a smile that crinkled the corners of her whole face. She had told me, through a translator, that before our system was installed, a mother in her village expected to lose at least one child to the river. The river gave life, but it also took it. It was just the way things were. After our project, she said, her own granddaughter, little Safi, was the first girl in her family's history to reach the age of 5 without ever having a single bout of dysentery. She had looked at me then, her eyes shining with tears, and said a single word in English, "Thank you." That one word, from that one woman, was worth more than Jeffrey's entire net worth. That was the work. That was the sizzle. And he had tried to burn it to the ground. That's when the dam broke. It wasn't a loud theatrical sob. It was a quiet, ragged sound that was torn from my chest. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, the vast map of my life's work looming over me. The tears were hot and sharp. It wasn't just for my job or my reputation. I was mourning the betrayal of the mission itself. For 10 years, the Sterling Hope Foundation had been more than an employer. It had been a sacred trust. I believed in its charter, in the legacy of the Sterling family. I had sacrificed relationships, holidays, a normal life, all in service of that belief. And in 6 short months, Jeffrey had turned it into a hollow corporate shell, a piggy bank for his family's grubby ambitions. The professional humiliation was a fire, but this was a deep, soul-level chill. It felt like sacrilege. I sat there for what felt like hours, surrounded by the ghosts of my achievements, feeling the weight of my own erasure. My name was now synonymous with failure. Every contact I had, every government official I'd worked with, every partner NGO, they had all seen that press release. My career wasn't just over. It had been poisoned at the root. To understand why I did what I did next, you have to understand the before time. Before Jeffrey, my boss, Arthur Sterling, was the sort of leader who doesn't exist anymore. He was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply, profoundly decent. He'd inherited the foundation from his father, and he carried its mission in his bones. He would visit the field sites with me at least once a year. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. I have a photograph on my desk of him, a man then in his late 60s, helping a local crew lay PVC pipe in a trench under the blazing Kenyan sun, his suit jacket slung over a nearby acacia tree. He trusted me implicitly. He'd approve my budgets with a nod, saying, "You know what you need, Alexandra. Just make it happen." He gave me the autonomy to build my own team, my own protocols, my own supply chains. We were a well-oiled machine, lean and effective. We built a culture of trust and purpose. My team would have followed me anywhere. That was the world Jeffrey had inherited, and he saw it not as a legacy to protect, but as an asset to be stripped. The flashbacks came in waves, unbidden. My first meeting with Jeffrey, the one where he dismissed my life's work as lacking sizzle. I remembered leaving his office feeling like I'd just been speaking a foreign language. Then there was the budget meeting a month later. He had his new CFO, a slick guy named Marcus, who looked like he'd been assembled from a catalog of generic corporate ambition, present a new financial framework. It was all about agile capital allocation and impact investing. They were rerouting a significant portion of the operational funds from established initiatives, my initiatives, into a new innovation incubator fund. When I pointed out that this would cripple our ability to maintain existing projects, let alone start new ones, Jeffrey had leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial tone. "Alexandra," he'd said, looking around the table as if sharing a secret, "the future of philanthropy isn't about digging holes in the dirt. It's about scalable tech. It's about a disruptive app that can connect donors directly to impact. It's about blockchain for charitable giving." He was selling them a dream, a glossy, frictionless fantasy of charity, without the messiness of reality. The board, mostly made up of corporate types who understood buzzwords better than they understood water tables, ate it up. I was the only one in the room shaking my head, a Cassandra in a sensible blazer. The true turning point, the moment that pushed me from passive concern to active self-preservation, came 3 months before I was fired. I had requested an emergency meeting about the Kivu funds. The wire transfers were being sent, but the local contacts I had on the ground, people I had trusted for years, were telling me a different story. No equipment had arrived. No teams were on site. When I presented this to Jeffrey in his office, with Marcus standing silently by his shoulder, he didn't even look at the documents I brought. He waved a dismissive hand. Logistics, Alexandra. International supply chains are complex. There are always delays. I pushed back. Jeffrey, this isn't a delay, this is a dead end. The money is going into an account, but it's not coming out the other side in the form of work. His smile tightened, the mask of charisma slipping for just a second. A flicker of genuine irritation showed in his eyes. Look, he'd said, his voice taking on a hard edge. I have a team of world-class financial analysts, Ivy League, who are managing this. You're a field director, a very good one, but your job is to manage the field, not the finances. Don't worry your pretty little head about the numbers. Let the big boys handle the spreadsheets. It was the pretty little head that did it, the sheer unadulterated condescension of it. He might as well have patted me on the head and offered me a biscuit. I felt a quiet heat flush up my neck. I looked from his smug face to Marcus's impassive one. I was being managed, handled, and dismissed like a child. I left his office, walked directly to my car, and drove to an electronics store. That's when I bought the recorder. I knew then that my concerns would never be heard. They would only ever be handled. If I was going to protect the work, and protect myself, I needed more than data. I needed proof. I needed his own words, and I resolved, in that moment, to get them. Back in my apartment, sitting on the floor, the despair began to recede, replaced by that same cold, clear resolve. It wasn't about revenge. I repeat that to myself, even now. It wasn't about revenge. That emotion is too hot, too chaotic. This was about justice. It was about restoring balance to a universe that Jeffrey had thrown violently out of whack. It was about Elodie and her granddaughter, Safi. It was about Arthur Sterling's legacy. It was about the promise we had made to people who had nothing but our word to trust. My gaze fell upon my bookshelf. Tucked between volumes on hydrology and project management was a thin, leather-bound journal. I hadn't opened it in years. I pulled it out. Inside, in elegant, looping script, was a note. It was from Eleanor Harrison, wife of Alistair Harrison, the Foundation's single largest private donor. Eleanor had been the true force behind Aquapura. She had championed it from the very beginning, seeding it with the first $1 million grant. She had passed away 2 years ago, a loss that was felt deeply throughout the Foundation. She had written the note to me after a trip to Ghana, where she'd visited one of our first successful sites. It read, Alexandra, to see the face of a child drinking clean water for the first time is to see the face of God. Thank you for making miracles manifest. Never let anyone tell you this work is anything less than sacred. Reading her words, I felt a jolt, as if a circuit had been completed. This was my catalyst. This was my path forward. Jeffrey had miscalculated. He thought he was playing a corporate game against a field operator. He didn't realize he was waging a war against a woman's sacred legacy, and he had no idea that I wasn't going to fight him on his turf. In the boardroom, I was going to fight him in the one place he had no power, the heart of his most important donor. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and began to compose a letter to Alistair Harrison. The plan began to take shape, not as a desperate act of retaliation, but as a calm, precise, and necessary surgical procedure. The secret wasn't the recording itself, it was the patience it took to get the right one. For 2 months, the tiny digital recorder became a part of my daily routine, nestled discreetly in the pen slot of my leather-bound notebook that I took to every meeting. At first, the recordings were just a collection of Jeffrey's greatest hits of corporate jargon. Hours of him talking about paradigm shifts, synergizing our core competencies, and blue sky thinking. It was a meaningless word salad, frustratingly useless. He was smart enough, or at least cautious enough, not to say anything overtly incriminating in a group setting. He performed for the board, for the other directors. He was always on stage. I knew the real conversations, the ones that mattered, happened behind closed doors. My challenge was getting into that room. My opportunity came in the form of a quarterly budget review. It was supposed to be a small meeting, just Jeffrey, his CFO Marcus, and me. It was designed to be an intimidation session. They intended to present me with the finalized, gutted budget for Aquapura for the next fiscal year and expect me to simply accept it. I walked into Jeffrey's office, the recorder silently active in my notebook on the table. The air was thick with that expensive citrus cologne and smug superiority. They presented the numbers on a large screen. My operational budget was cut by 70%. All expansion was halted. The maintenance fund for existing projects was slashed to a point that I knew would lead to system failures within a year. They weren't just cutting my funding, they were sentencing our past work to a slow, deliberate death. I let them finish their presentation. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just listened, my expression carefully neutral. When they were done, I asked a simple, quiet question. Where is the 70% being reallocated? Marcus started to give a canned answer about the innovation incubator, but Jeffrey, impatient and arrogant, cut him off. He leaned back, that brilliant smile plastered on his face. Alexandra, we're pivoting to a high-yield, high-impact tech play. Philanthropy 2.0. We're getting in on the ground floor of something that's going to revolutionize the digital privacy space. It's a sure thing. My heart started beating a little faster. This was it. I kept my voice steady, feigning a naive curiosity. A tech venture? That sounds fascinating. Is it one of the companies in the incubator portfolio? Jeffrey chuckled, a low, condescending sound. Not exactly. This one is special. It's an outside investment, a bit of a strategic acquisition. A company called Viridian Sentinel. He said the name with a flourish of pride. I didn't react, but inside, a lock clicked open. Viridian Sentinel. I made a small, meaningless note on my pad, my hand steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I pushed a little further, playing the part of the dutiful but slightly confused director. It's unusual for the foundation to make a direct private investment like that, isn't it? Especially with donor funds designated for a specific initiative. Jeffrey's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He glanced at Marcus. The Foundation's charter gives us a certain amount of flexibility in how we pursue our mission, he said, his voice a little colder now. We're interpreting clean water in a broader sense. Data is the new water. Alexandra, protecting people's digital lives is a form of humanitarian aid. It was the most ludicrous, transparently self-serving justification I had ever heard. But then came the final, damning piece. Marcus, ever the loyal soldier, jumped in to support his boss. And Jeffrey has a personal connection to the leadership at Viridian, he said smoothly. It gives us a unique level of insight and assurance. Jeffrey beamed, picking up the thread. Exactly. The CEO is a real visionary. Brilliant young guy. My brother, actually. He said it so casually, as if he were mentioning his brother ran a local coffee shop, not that he was about to funnel $500,000 of charitable money, my money, Elodie's money, into his sibling's tech startup. I kept my composure, asked a few more bland questions about timelines, and then thanked them for their time. As I walked out of his office, the recording still silently capturing the sound of their self-congratulatory laughter, I felt like I was carrying a live grenade. Now I had the weapon. But a weapon is useless without a strategy. Just sending the tape to the press would be messy. It would create a scandal, but it might not remove Jeffrey. He was a master of spinning narratives. He could claim the tape was doctored, taken out of context. He would burn the whole foundation to the ground to save himself. I needed a different approach. I needed an attack that was precise, undeniable, and left him no room to maneuver. That's when my mind turned to Alistair Harrison. But I couldn't just approach him cold. I needed more. I needed to connect Viridian Sentinel directly to the missing Kivu funds. I needed internal proof, and for that I needed an ally. Her name was Maria Sanchez. She was a junior financial analyst, barely 2 years out of college, hidden away in a cubicle in the finance department. I had worked with her on a few budget reconciliations in the past, and had been impressed by her meticulous attention to detail and her quiet, fierce intelligence. She was one of the few people who had messaged me after I was fired with a simple, heartfelt, "This is wrong. I'm so sorry." She saw the numbers for what they were. A story, and she knew the story of my department's finances was a clean one. I took a risk. I invited her for coffee at a small, out-of-the-way cafe, far from the Foundation's offices. I didn't tell her about the recording. I didn't need to. I just laid out my suspicions. I told her about the Kivu project, the slick but empty reports, the strange new wire transfer protocols that bypassed my team. I asked her if she had seen anything unusual. Her eyes, which were usually bright and engaged, were clouded with worry. She glanced around the cafe nervously before leaning in. "Alexandra," she whispered, "it's worse than you think. The transfers to Kivu, they go to a holding company in the Cayman Islands, a shell corporation. Then, a few days later, an identical amount is transferred from that holding company to Viridian Sentinel. It's a two-step, a classic pass-through." She said they were coding the Viridian payments as consulting fees for the innovation incubator. It was a paper trail, but a deliberately obscured one. She told me she had flagged it for Marcus, her direct superior, and he had told her in no uncertain terms to unflag it and forget she ever saw it. He told her she was a team player, and team players don't ask questions they don't need to know the answers to. She was scared. She had student loans, a career to build, but she also had a conscience. I could see the conflict warring in her face. I didn't pressure her. I just said, "I'm going to do something about this, Maria, but I need to be able to prove it. Any documentation you could provide would be helpful." I left it at that. 2 days later, a plain manila envelope was slipped under my apartment door. No return address. Inside was a single USB drive. It contained copies of the wire transfer authorizations, first to the Cayman Shell Company, and then from the Shell Company to Viridian Sentinel. It also contained Viridian's incorporation documents. The founder and majority shareholder was listed as one Daniel Pritchard. Jeffrey's full name was Jeffrey Pritchard. It was the final, irrefutable link. Maria had taken an immense risk. She was my silent, unsung hero. Now, my plan was complete. It had 3 parts: the package for Alistair Harrison, the timing, and the fallout. The package was an exercise in precision. I bought a new high-quality gift box. Inside, I placed 2 items. First, a small silver USB drive. On it was a single audio file, labeled meeting._date_, and a single PDF document, labeled documentation. Second, I placed the thin leather-bound journal, containing his late wife's note to me. I didn't include a long rambling letter of my own. I wrote a simple 3-sentence note on a plain white card. "Mr. Harrison," it began, "I believe Jeffrey Pritchard is dismantling your wife's most cherished legacy. Here is the proof. The rest is up to you." I signed it simply, "Alexandra." I didn't make demands. I didn't threaten. I just presented the evidence, framed not as a personal grievance, but as a desecration of his wife's memory. I was banking on the fact that his love for Eleanor was more powerful than Jeffrey's influence. I sent the package via a bonded courier, with signature confirmation, directly to his private residence, not the Foundation. The courier receipt was my proof of delivery. The silent takeover had begun. The silence that followed was the hardest part. For 3 days, nothing happened. I resisted the urge to check the news, to call Maria, to do anything at all. I just had to trust my strategy. I had to trust that I had understood Alistair Harrison correctly. He wasn't a man who would fly into a rage and make a public scene. He was an old money industrialist, a man who built a global empire through quiet, deliberate moves. He was a chess player, and I had just placed Jeffrey in check. I just had to wait for him to see it. The first tremor came not as an earthquake, but as a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. It came in the form of an email from Maria. It was a forward of a company-wide calendar invitation. The subject was emergency board meeting. The organizer was not Jeffrey, but Thomas Chamberlain, the chairman of the board. The optional attendees list was a roll call of the foundation's top executives. My name, of course, was not on it. Maria added a single line of her own at the top of the forward. Heard Chamberlain's assistant on the phone with Mr. Harrison's office all morning. Something's happening. That was the first sign. The first crack in Jeffrey's perfectly curated facade. He wouldn't have known what the meeting was about. Not at first. He would have assumed it was about the fallout from the Ghost Project scandal. A meeting to strategize a public relations response. He would have walked into that boardroom with his usual swagger, ready to perform. But Harrison was smarter than that. He hadn't called Jeffrey. He hadn't called the press. He had called the one man who had power over Jeffrey, the chairman of the board. He had made his first move on the board. Silently, precisely, and with devastating effect. I can only imagine the scene inside the foundation's headquarters. Maria, my loyal ally, gave me a running commentary via discreet text messages, a series of short, tense updates that painted a vivid picture of the growing panic. Her first text simply said, "Doors are closed. They're in the main boardroom." An hour later, Jeffrey's assistant just came out to get him coffee. She looks terrified. The panic was spreading. Jeffrey had built his power base on an illusion of control and forward momentum. He was the visionary, the rainmaker. The first hint that he wasn't in complete command, that a power greater than his was now in play, would have sent ripples of fear through his loyalists. Marcus, his CFO, was probably sweating through his suit, replaying every conversation, every doctored expense report in his head. The executives who had applauded his disruptive vision were likely now wondering if they had backed the wrong horse. Jeffrey's panic must have truly set in when he realized what he was facing. The emergency meeting wasn't a PR session, it was an inquest. Harrison's office wouldn't have sent the audio file. Not yet. They would have done something much more subtle. They would have sent a single polite request from Harrison's personal accounting firm to the board, requesting a full independent audit of all expenditures related to the Kivu Initiative and the Innovation Incubator Fund, citing a discrepancy noted by the donor. That one word, discrepancy, when coming from a man who contributed nearly a third of the foundation's annual operating budget, would have been a nuclear bomb detonated in the quiet halls of the foundation. It bypassed Jeffrey entirely. It went right to the board's fiduciary responsibility. They had no choice but to comply. Jeffrey was no longer the one asking the questions. He was the one who had to provide the answers, and he knew the answers were buried in a Cayman Islands shell corporation. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text came through from the same number. "Alexandra, it's Jeffrey. We need to talk. Call me." The shift in tone was seismic. There was no condescension, no corporate posturing, just a raw, naked urgency. He was losing control of the narrative, and it was terrifying him. I didn't respond. My silence was a weapon now. Every unanswered call and text another turn of the screw. He called again. And again. I pictured him in his glass-walled office, the confident mask cracking, revealing the desperate, cornered man underneath. He was making frantic calls, his voice probably tight with a panicky rage, demanding to know what was going on. But no one would have answers for him. The power was shifting, silently, inexorably, away from him. The true master stroke came 2 days later. It wasn't a press release about an investigation. It was something far more elegant and destructive. Alistair Harrison didn't pull his money from the foundation. That would have been messy, and it would have hurt the foundation's other legitimate projects. Instead, he did something that showed his genius for corporate warfare. He issued a public announcement, which ran in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. It stated that he was forming a new, independent charitable trust, the Eleanor Harrison Clean Water Legacy. Its sole, stated mission was to fund and support transparent, effective and field-proven water purification and sanitation projects in developing nations. The announcement mentioned an initial endowment of $50 million, a staggering sum that dwarfed the Sterling Hope Foundation's entire operational budget for Africa. It was a declaration of war, fought not with accusations, but with capital. The second paragraph of the announcement was the kill shot. It stated that the new trust would be actively inviting partnerships with donors who share a commitment to direct quantifiable impact and absolute financial transparency. It was a quiet, formal, and utterly ruthless poaching of the Sterling Hope Foundation's entire donor base. He wasn't just leaving, he was taking the lifeboats with him. He was building a new ark and inviting all the other animals to jump off Jeffrey's sinking ship. Maria told me the phones at the foundation started ringing off the hook, but they weren't calls from the press. They were calls from the personal assistants of the foundation's other major donors, all politely declining to renew their annual pledges and requesting meetings with Mr. Harrison's office. It was a silent, bloodless coup. The client exodus had begun. The power had not just shifted, it had completely changed hands. Jeffrey was no longer the CEO of a prestigious foundation. He was the captain of a ghost ship. His authority rendered meaningless as his resources, his influence, and his future vanished into the coffers of his rival. Jeffrey's desperation escalated from panic to outright frenzy. He made his final predictable move. He had the foundation's legal team, a high-priced firm that had been on retainer for decades, send a cease-and-desist letter to Alistair Harrison. The letter was a work of blustering fiction, accusing Harrison of tortious interference and attempting to destabilize the foundation. It was a scare tactic, a legal tantrum. Harrison's legal team, which was likely composed of the kind of lawyers who eat corporate bullies for breakfast, responded with a one-sentence letter that Maria later told me was framed and hung in the breakroom of Harrison's new trust. It simply said, "We welcome the opportunity for legal discovery." It was the corporate equivalent of "Bring it on." The threat of a lawsuit, which would have forced the public disclosure of every single financial record Jeffrey had tried to hide, was the last thing he wanted. His bluff had been called. That evening, my phone rang again. It was Jeffrey. This time, I answered. I said nothing. I just listened to the silence on the other end of the line. For a few seconds, all I could hear was his breathing, ragged and uneven. "Alexandra," he finally said, his voice strained, stripped of all its practiced charisma. "Okay, you win." I still said nothing. I let the silence hang in the air, a space for him to fill with his own defeat. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Do you want your job back? I'll give you your job back. A raise, a big one, vice president of the whole foundation. Whatever you want, we can put this all back in the box. We can release a joint statement. Say the Kivu thing was a misunderstanding, a third-party contractor issue. We can fix this." The offer was so pathetic, so utterly divorced from the new reality of the situation, that I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. Almost. He still thought this was a negotiation. He still thought he had something to offer me. I finally spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and quiet. "There is no box, Jeffrey," I said. "You burned it." He started to babble, to plead, talking about his reputation, his family, the board. I didn't engage. I just listened to him unravel. Then, I said the words that I had been waiting to say for months. "I have a meeting tomorrow morning, Jeffrey. I have to go." And I hung up. I pictured him staring at his phone. The dead air on the other end, a final confirmation that he was utterly, completely, and irrevocably powerless. The exodus of donors had been the strategic victory. This call, this desperate, pleading, pathetic call, This was the emotional one. It wasn't about revenge. It was about hearing the sound of a bully's power crumbling into dust, and it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The final meeting took place in the same boardroom where Jeffrey had once lectured me about sizzle. This time, however, the room felt different. The air wasn't charged with Jeffrey's performative energy. It was heavy with a cold corporate dread. Alistair Harrison sat at the head of the long, polished table, where the chairman of the board usually sat. He was an older man, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored gray suit, his face a mask of calm, patrician authority. Thomas Chamberlain, the chairman, sat to his right, looking pale and diminished. The rest of the board members were scattered around the table, avoiding eye contact with each other, and at the far end, looking small and rumpled, was Jeffrey. He wasn't wearing one of his flashy, confident suits. He looked like he had slept in his clothes. I was there at Mr. Harrison's explicit request. I wasn't a participant. I was an observer. I sat in a chair against the wall, behind Mr. Harrison, saying nothing. My presence in the room was a statement in itself. The meeting began without pleasantries. Mr. Harrison placed a small silver audio player on the table. He didn't look at Jeffrey. He addressed the entire board. "I was given this recording," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of his authority. "It contains a conversation between Mr. Pritchard and his CFO, Marcus, regarding the foundation's finances. I believe it clarifies certain discrepancies." Jeffrey went white. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but Mr. Harrison held up a single silencing hand. "I will only play 30 seconds, he said. "I believe that will be sufficient." He pressed the play button. The sound of Jeffrey's voice filled the silent room, tinny and artificial coming from the small speaker, but undeniably his. "We're pivoting to a high-yield, high-impact tech play, a company called Viridian Sentinel. It's a sure thing. The CEO is a real visionary. Brilliant young guy. My brother, actually." Mr. Harrison pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of guilt and complicity. In those 30 seconds, every lie Jeffrey had told, every buzzword he had hidden behind, was stripped away. The board members, who had been so easily charmed by his vision, now looked at him with a mixture of horror and contempt. They weren't just looking at a failed CEO, they were looking at a man who had made them his fools. Mr. Harrison let the silence stretch for a long, painful moment. Then he spoke again, his voice still calm, but now with an edge of steel. "The Eleanor Harrison Clean Water Legacy," he announced, "will require a director with a proven decade-long track record of flawless financial oversight and unparalleled success in the field. Someone who understands that this work is not about sizzle, but about survival." He paused, and for the first time, turned his head slightly, and met my eyes. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a coronation. In that moment, everyone in the room understood the new reality. Jeffrey was finished. His career in this city, in this industry, was over. He had been so focused on my poor oversight that he had failed to notice his own catastrophic lack of it. Chamberlain, the chairman, cleared his throat. "Jeffrey," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "I think it's best if you tender your resignation immediately." Jeffrey just stared, his mouth slightly agape. A man completely hollowed out. He didn't have the fight in him to even argue. He simply nodded, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the room. Not with a bang, but with a pathetic, shuffling whimper. The news came out the next day that he had resigned for personal reasons. Marcus, the CFO, was let go the same afternoon. The system, once it was presented with irrefutable truth, had finally corrected itself. My vindication was complete, but I felt no elation, no triumphant joy, just a quiet, profound sense of order being restored. The noise was over. Now the real work could begin again. My new reality wasn't in a corner office with a fancy title. It wasn't about being a vice president or a director. A month later, I was on a dusty airstrip in the Kivu region, the place where the Ghost Project was supposed to be. I was overseeing the unloading of the first shipment of drilling equipment, paid for by the first grant from the Eleanor Harrison Clean Water Legacy. The air smelled of red dirt and diesel fuel. It was the best smell in the world. This story, when I tell it, sounds like it's about revenge. A meticulous, long game plan to take down a corporate villain. But as I stand here now, looking back on it all, I can tell you with absolute certainty that it wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a fire that consumes you. This was about something else entirely. It was about restoration. It was about rebuilding something that had been deliberately broken. Jeffrey and I were playing two different games. He was playing for money and status, temporary things that can vanish in an instant. I was playing for a legacy, for a promise made to people like Elodie, for the memory of a woman like Eleanor Harrison. My victory wasn't in his downfall. It was in the first turn of the drill biting into the dry earth of Kivu. It was in the sound of clean water finally flowing where it had been promised. That is a victory that no one can ever take away. My new office isn't an office at all. It's a satellite phone, a ruggedized laptop, and a seat on whatever plane, truck, or boat is heading in the right direction. My name is on the letterhead of the trust, not as a CEO, but as the Executive Director of Field Operations. It's the same work, but with a new, unbreakable foundation of trust beneath it. The plaque on the wall that matters isn't in a boardroom. It's the one we will eventually affix to the completed Kivu purification plant, with Eleanor Harrison's name carved into it. That is the only vindication I ever needed. The real moral of this story isn't about getting even, it's about knowing your own value when no one else does. It's about understanding that true power isn't in a title or a corner office, it's in your competence, your integrity, and the relationships you build. It's about keeping your own records, not out of paranoia, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that you must be the ultimate guardian of your own work and your own reputation. Jeffrey's mistake was underestimating me, yes. But his fatal error was in believing that the work itself didn't matter, that it was just a backdrop for his ambition. He was wrong, the work is all that matters. So I want to speak directly to anyone out there who feels like they're in a similar position, to anyone who has been overlooked, underestimated, or had their contributions erased. Do not let their noise drown out the quiet confidence of your own competence. Keep your head down, do the work, and build your case. Your moment will come. Don't let anyone else define your worth. You are the architect of your own career, and sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to calmly and quietly build a new structure when the old one proves to be rotten to the core. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that sting of being undervalued, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly helps. Leave a comment below and share a piece of your own story if you feel comfortable. Reading them reminds me that none of us are alone in these battles. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it today, and of course, subscribe to the channel for more stories about turning injustice into vindication. Thank you for listening.